want to now go to our extinguished guest. We've got a great lineup tonight on tonight's show of No2Nato. Now, Mick Stott is coming right up, and he's a retired captain who served in the British Army for 30 years in the Physical Training Corps. He now specializes in the effective treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. Mick, it's a pleasure to welcome you to No2Nato.
Thank you, Simeon. It's really interesting watching your story, because one of the topics that I'd like to discuss is sovereignty. And of course, the biggest question is our sovereignty. One of the only people that I think is calling it out is George. And of course, the Workers' Party, that was one of the reasons that I connected with it. But equally, right at the start, when COVID came out, having served for a number of years, I was always very skeptical of some of the decisions that the government made. And so no surprise to me that when Ofcom started to censor voices, that was a typical tactic of any regime or organization that wanted to control a narrative. And you can't possibly control a narrative in what's supposed to be a democratic country, because that's completely the antithesis to democracy. So knowing what we knew about Iraq and Tony Blair being an international war criminal, it comes as a surprise to an awful lot of people. You know, for me as a serving soldier of 30 years, I find it very interesting to even challenge the reasons that I joined the military, having spent time on operations and also spent that amount of time in and around my fellow colleagues in the army. And so it would almost be heresy to suggest on any level that we would say no to NATO. But if we think about sovereignty and we think about who actually is pulling the strings and who controls our government, and we look at those lines of control, they're becoming more and more obvious. And so it might come as a surprise that when this all started to roll as far back as 2019, that I was very, very aware of something that was going on and the conversations that were blackballed in Parliament because of some of the people I was talking to. And what an awful lot of people that are still serving and veteran communities out there might not appreciate is that we do not have a sovereign force anymore. And we don't have a sovereign force because after Brexit was signed in 2019, revised and signed, in September 2019, three civil servants, namely Brockbank, Langley and Robbins, what they did was they signed us up to 8 EU contracts. And of course, those 8 EU contracts tied us up to Brussels, the oligarchs that are in Brussels. And a guy called Major General Campbell was aware of this, and he tried to fight this, but was silenced essentially. Major General Campbell was the commander that led the British forces into the Falklands conflict, which ironically is possibly the only legal war that we've been involved in, because it involved sovereign turf. And of course, the defense of sovereign turf. So we can't possibly justify being in some of these places as a force. But the 8 EU contracts that came live on the 1st of January 2021, what they did was they pretty much said that if the EU has a bit of an issue and it wants to resolve that issue by the use of force, then the British would no longer get a say in that, because they would be deployed by the EU. These contracts also, what they did was they took away any sovereignty, because what it meant was that we could be tasked, deployed, procurement, and all of the types of functionality that we would normally keep within our own house, so to speak, would then be given away to Brussels and the oligarchs in Brussels. So essentially, the idea for any veteran or any serving person within the British forces at the moment that we are a British force is an absolute nonsense. And of course, some of us became very, very aware of this a long time ago. We started to wake up. And what I did as a matter of course what I did was I started to train people to exercise the basic human rights and using the vehicle of natural law, because we wanted people to be able to say no to some of the things that we were being forced into. If we don't get a choice as to whether or not we engage with another country, then at that point, that is really, there's nothing sovereign about that. And equally, if we can't vote a government out fairly, then again, there is nothing sovereign about that. But sovereignty does actually start with the individual standing up and saying no. And of course, I don't buy into any element of war, having been there and understand what it does. It creates nothing but poverty, mayhem, and just situations that are devoid completely of love, care, and consideration. And it's normally those people that are on the receiving end of that have no say in it and suffer the worst. Meanwhile, the people that support and fund it are the ones who are then generating all the wealth from it. So there are no surprises that when you look at the arms that are going to Ukraine, that when you look at who's providing the arms and where the funds are going for those, they're going back to those companies that coincidentally run the world. And you know, people, I think, that bother to look will see that the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets of this world are all very, very interested parties, because they're some of the main beneficiaries of that. And so people wake up at their own pace, I think. And one of the things that veterans and serving personnel should pay attention to is the fact that Keir Starmer, in the last month, stated that what he was going to do was he was going to reconnect and reaffiliate to the EU. Well, they'd already done that. Those contracts came live in 21. And so for me, that's known as retrospective honesty, because it's already happened. It was the hottest potato in Parliament when it was happening. People wouldn't even discuss it. And Keir Starmer, now that he came into power, which is no coincidence in my world, and nor is it a surprise that he's just continued to do more of what was being done before, and then added a considerable amount of weight to that as well. So when those contracts came live, we lost our sovereignty. We lost our sovereignty as a force. It's very, very unusual that we would ever send any of our hardware to any other situation. And I just think this was an excuse, a vehicle for amalgamating those contracts that had already been signed. So Starmer is using something called retrospective honesty in my book, and retrospective honesty is not honesty. It's because it would have to come out at some point. People would have to realise that it had already been done, and an awful lot of people were not aware of that. And of course, Starmer is a man of many faces, but mainly only uses two. So we don't really expect much honesty from someone like that. The thing that never ceases to surprise me is that all these people that decide to take us to war, you never see their children at the front line. They're never there holding rifle and bayonet right at the front. And so, as far as I'm concerned, our sovereignty was lost a considerable period of time ago, and the narrative that has reigned since then, the narrative is the mainstream media are still owned by the same people who want you to believe. And I have a simple philosophy. If your library is smaller than your TV, then there's a good chance you're going to believe everything that you see on TV. And that's not really much good for anyone. So it's really important that people do actually do their own homework and take a look at some of these things from their own perspectives. And I think I'm preaching to the converted when I talk about that on here. My main specialism after I resigned my commission in the military was post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you look at the build-up from COVID to where we are right now, governments have lied and cheated. If you look at the parties that were held in Parliament while we were being told to stay at home, all of those things literally were designed, as far as I'm concerned, to disrupt. And of course, when we start to disrupt everyday environments and everyday situations, that in itself creates a level of confusion. and it opens the door for potential trauma. One of the things that really excited me about the Workers' Party was when George did his speech at the Union, the Oxford Union, his speech, because he talked about the Tommy Atkins, which was the soldier that was forgotten. You know, the guy that was the average Tom, the average soldier, the unknown man, really, but was always at the forefront of all of this action. And of course, a lot of that, as we understand through the indoctrination of training, we get lost in that. So with regards to trauma, if you consider what is going on in the broader sense, if we interrupt your life and we interrupt your daily life, which happened, as I said, from 2020 onwards, then that in itself, even COVID, the situation with COVID had a huge impact on people. And, you know, I can measure this in the UK. There was an unbelievable impact on children that were forced to stay home, and then they didn't want to go back to school. So there was all sorts.
Mick, I wanted to just stop you there. Look, you've made some very good points on sovereignty and the Keir Starmer government's disregard for the wishes of the people. I mean, the British people clearly don't want British involvement in Ukraine or British boots on the ground. Just yesterday, in a shocking revelation, British Defence Minister Alistair Cairns warned that the British Army could be destroyed within 6 months to a year in the event of a major war, similar to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. With the army at its smallest size since the 1700s, Cairns emphasized the critical role of reservists in maintaining the nation's defense capabilities. We all know, the British people know, other countries in the world know, I know, you know, and the Russians know that the British military is extremely weak at the moment. It's in terms of numbers, in terms of morale, I would say also, and that's a question I want to put to you. It's not for me to speak on that. It's much more credible if you can comment on that. But morale in terms of, would British people, when we talk about reservists, would they be willing to get onto transport planes and fly to Poland to be transferred to the Russian front in Ukraine to go and fight for Zelensky? I'm probably a rhetorical question.
I don't think they would, and I don't think it will ever happen anyway. You know, I do talk to serving people, and these are some people that are right at the top of the tree. People that when I was serving, I took them through their journey into the military, and I did serve at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, which is the establishment that trains all of our officers and a number of other foreign officers. So it is pretty much the kite mark for the highest quality of training. So, you know, the question is, would people sign up to that? You know, there's a whole new tranche of people that are coming into this world right now, and they're taught emotional intelligence. Certainly when I went through school, EQ was never really something that was talked about or discussed. And that then spread into the military, where recruits could then sort of say, I'm not happy with the treatment I'm being given. This is a red card. This is a green card. Now, that was completely alien to anything that we would have ever been allowed to do when we were training as soldiers. So the whole essence of the training is designed to make somebody, let's say, more emotionally intelligent and aware. And in reality, in wartime, that's the last thing you want, because what will happen naturally is people will be more compassionate, they will be more considerate, they will be allowed to express their emotional states. And all of those don't necessarily equal a great fighting force. And they certainly, if you look at a situation that you've got in Ukraine at the moment, where British soldiers are volunteers. And of course, that's what makes them excellent soldiers, because they volunteered for the role. There's a massive difference between volunteering for a role and being forced into a role. And, you know, the old saying that one volunteer is worth 20 pressed men goes a long way. If you go back as far as World War I, what we recognised in World War I, that anything up to 30% of the people in the trenches weren't actually shooting at anyone because they didn't want to hurt anyone.
So just stop you there. You're saying that the British soldiers fighting in Ukraine are very good or effective, essentially, you're saying, because they're volunteers.
I think that a volunteer is always going to be more effective than a pressed man. I wouldn't say what the standard of a British soldier is these days, because I've seen a lot of mission creep when it comes to standards and qualification. Are they as good as they used to be? I suppose every older person might say, no, they're not. They're not as good as they
Well,
are.
look, I do agree on your point in terms of volunteers and people who are pressed into the military. If we look at the Ukrainian military, it's quite clear that that is a military of soldiers who are forcibly recruited, arrested on the streets, kidnapped, and thrown to the front lines. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, thanks to very wealthy Russian cash reserves through oil and gas and other exports, Russia is simply offering huge amounts of money to volunteers, to soldiers, and people are signing up. Something like 30,000 Russian men every month sign up to fight. And they receive huge, in Russian terms, even in Western terms, they receive huge wages, absolutely huge wages. So, I mean, Vladimir Putin has committed 1/3 of the country's budget to the war. And that, of course, predominantly goes to funding the social benefits and the wages of soldiers. And the good news is for the Russians, when the soldiers are being paid very well, extremely well, that money is then coming back into the Russian economy, to their families, to their wives, to their children, and being spent in Russian cities and towns. So it's a great strategy to pay your soldiers well. And in the event of death, there's also a very, very high remuneration, compensation, and insurance type situation. So, unlike the Ukrainian side, and we all know the motivation is very lacking on the Ukrainian side, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
But look, I can tell you that it's, even if it wasn't for the high wages in the Russian military, they'd still have Russian men signing up to fight, because it's a matter of defending Russia against a combined force of 55 countries all around the world. But look, it's good to hear your opinion as a veteran of 30 years in the British military. And what's your final closing statement? What's your message to the Russian military, to the Russian soldiers? And knowing that Vladimir Putin has called upon everyone to mobilize, well, can I say that extends to all of us, and even you in Britain. You can all mobilize, and everyone can play their part. You can play your part, Mick, and your colleagues in the United Kingdom, because public opinion is a very important factor in any healthy democracy. And when public opinion is overwhelmingly against sending British Storm Shadow missiles or committing Britain to World War III, that's a great thing for de-escalation and a potential settlement of this conflict on Russia's terms. So yeah, go ahead and your closing statement.
Yeah, I don't think that the government represent the opinion that is in the UK. If you look at what Sunak did when he talked about conscription, that literally was always going to lose him the vote. It was always going to lose him the vote, because your generations that we have now are not driven the same way that we're driven. They're used to greater lifestyles. They have a lot more money. They have a lot more wealth. So I think that that there is definitely a disconnect between what the politicians would like you to believe, the mainstream message that they give out, and the actual opinions of the average person. And I'm not convinced that we would be even remotely motivated to go and fight a conflict in that place, when in reality it isn't even a lawful war, because it's not defending our own sovereign turf. So it's an unlawful war, and it would be very, very hard to justify in the mind of a professional that bothers to do their research. And a lot of guys these days, they do their research. There's a lot of people that are waking up as we speak and saying no. And you can see this on Facebook with scoping strategies that the government use when they put an opinion out there, just to see how people respond to it. So I think there's a big disconnect, Simeon, and I think it's doomed to fail, to be honest. If the British people were forced into something, I think you would see a big reaction against them.
Can't say I disagree with you. In fact, I completely agree with you. And it's good to know that there are British veterans, many British veterans, experienced, seasoned veterans such as yourself, who are patriots of their country And as patriots of their country, as you are, you see that this is the wrong thing for Britain. It's the wrong thing to be getting involved in a war against Russia. It's a dead end in the very real sense that it will bring about dead people, including British people. And that's not what Russia wants. And that's probably what Zelensky wants. Zelensky doesn't care how many people die to protect his own interests and his regime's interests. And unfortunately, on the chopping block, first up are Ukrainians, and he's genociding his own people, and he's attracting all sorts of mercenaries and far-right fanatics and Nazis and extremists, foreign fighters from all around the world, from Colombia, from Australia, from New Zealand, from the United Kingdom, from Poland. Lots of Poles, lots of Polish people dying. Russian soldiers often report that they can hear Polish chatter on the radios, and they're discovering these mercenaries fighting not only in Ukraine, but actually invading Russian sovereign territory in the Kursk region. I mean,
well, the thing is, Timmy, and it's worth remembering this as well. If you look at the way the British government have treated the veteran, this is my closing statement. If you look at the prison population, on average, it's about 13% of the prison population are veterans. If you look at the probation population, about 13% of those are veterans, and they are the majority are non-habitual criminals. So George's speech at the Union was perfect, because what he says was that even if you do go to fight for your country, by the way, they're going to hang you out to dry when you get home.
Absolutely. Can't say I disagree. Thank you very much for joining us, Mick Stott, on No2Nato.